Good afternoon and welcome to this third lecture of CVSP 202. CVSP core courses are designed to provide an interdisciplinary engagement with ideas that have shaped human existence across different periods and cultures through the reading of great books or classics. Now, the selection and ordering of these texts is not neutral, obviously. It is already a way of telling a particular story. Therefore, it should always be open to interpretation and even contestation. Why this text and not another? Why at this point of the semester and not another? I'm sure you have thought about these questions and perhaps even addressed them in your sections. Now, my name is Gubara. I'm an assistant professor in the Civilization Studies program here at AUB, but I'm an intellectual historian by specialization. So I'm especially interested in these questions of canon formation. In other words, how is knowledge produced? How is it ordered? How is it classified, etc.? Or why and how historians decide that such and such a theme or author is important or representative of a time and a place. Is precisely what I research and write about. And I always begin with the premise that history is a dialogue. It's a dialogue between the past and the present. A specific historical narrative tells a story about the past, that's true, but it also says something about the present. In that sense, it is important to stress that what I will be presenting to you today is only one interpretation among many. And I hope that your section leaders will explore other possible versions with you that you will compare and contrast to what you will hear today. So let us take the case of the readings for CVSP 202 so far. You began with antiquity and philosophy, presented by Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus as a philosophical background to monotheism. You then moved to early Christianity, embodied in the figure of St. Augustine, and now you have arrived at this week's readings, something on your syllabus that is called Classical Islamic Thought, featuring Ikhwan al-Safa and al-Ghazali. Now, this selection of texts and themes is obviously already full of meaning. To begin with, it seeks to create connections between these texts. The terms themselves are also full of meaning. The idea of classical Islamic thought, for example, is usually meant to refer to a certain period, roughly the 9th to the 10th century AD, and often in terms of space, often in what is under the Great Abbasid dynasty. The Abbasids were an Islamic dynasty that ruled for many centuries. That period, the 9th or 10th century, is described often as a golden age, right? The golden age of Islam, al-Asr al-Dhahabi. This is a period when Islam's essential features and greatest contributions to human civilization were made. After this period, Islamic thought and civilization are said to have entered a long period of decline or inhitat, until more recent efforts at European-led modernization that begin in the 19th century. Now, this paradigm of a golden age and decline, is deeply problematic, and I would like to begin from a different point of departure today. So rather than having to define what's classical about the thought of Ikhwan al-Safa and al-Ghazali, I would like us to think of them as classics of Islamic thought, forcing us, in other words, to reflect on how and why they speak to us today. For what else is a classic other than a connecting thread between the past, however distant and different, and the present, however joyful or bleak? And it's looking kind of bleak these days, I'd say. So my main question to you then is this. Do we read Ikhwan al-Safa and al-Ghazali just as representatives of 10th century Abbasid thought in Islamic history? Or can reading them still resonate with us today? Can we find something stimulating and interesting in them today? In order to help us with this problem, I want to introduce to you two important ideas that will frame the rest of my lecture. Late antiquity and Islam as a tradition. These ideas are quite difficult and complex, so please bear with me as I try to explain them and do not hesitate to stop me if you have any questions. So late antiquity. The first question we are faced with when studying a text is to identify its context, the time, place, and cultural world of its writing. In our case here, this begins inevitably with the revelation of the Quran. Now, as you all know, Islam first arose in a narrow stretch of the Hijaz, the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula, but expanded with lightning speed into other Middle Eastern regions and beyond, as you can see from this map. There's the peninsula in brown, and you can see the expansion. Now, two broad approaches to the history of Islam have been dominant. One view sees Islam as a specifically Arabian religion. The other argues that it was so profoundly influenced by its contact with the established Byzantine and Persian cultures that the Islam of the Umayyads, another dynasty, an earlier dynasty, and the Abbasids bears very little to its original native land. These positions may appear opposite, but they share something crucial in common. They both rely on the assumption that Arabia was marginal and isolated from its surroundings. So basically, if I go back to the map, you see it there. That stretch of land in brown, which ostensibly is actually the center of the then known world, is still seen as somehow marginal and isolated. Okay? By contrast, more recent studies insist that the Arabian Peninsula was in fact part and parcel of the late antique world that stretched over the entire domains once unified by Alexander the Great, whom you may have encountered as Aristotle's famous student. A large geographical area crisscrossed by long-standing and wide-ranging networks of exchange. In other words, we are not dealing here with the startling, almost incomprehensible emergence from the darkness of some isolated desert of a nomadic people armed merely with the sword and the word of a fierce god. Culturally and linguistically polyglot, connected for centuries by trade routes, pilgrimage routes, imperial expansion and contraction, the world of late antique Arabia was a space where ancient thought and religions competed and coalesced, with monotheistic traditions of various sorts, so Christian and Jewish, as well as Islamic. In fact, our late colleague Kamal Salibi made a famous, in the history department here, made a famous argument that no less than the Bible came from Arabia. But without going into such big a proposition, think a little bit about the story of the Kaaba. You know, does anyone know what the Kaaba is? Anybody? Yeah? Just yell. Exactly, it's the sanctuary in Mecca, right? The house of God. You see it on TV, it's a cubic structure, a black cubic structure. So think simply about the Kaaba, right? The building of the Kaaba, that is supposedly to have been built with the aid of either a Greek, Egyptian, or an Ethiopian carpenter. Now, the simple fact that we can imagine a Greek, Egyptian, or Ethiopian carpenter in Mecca in the 7th century, I think already shows how open the Hijaz was to the world around it. Okay. But it is important to think of this notion of late antiquity not just as a space of lived interaction between Muslims and non-Muslims, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, sometimes involving political, social, economic, or cultural relations. Crucially, it is also a space where ideas, concepts, words, ideologies, stories, and memories also flowed with ease. In this sense, late antiquity is not merely a chronological epoch, a period of historical assessment or writing. Yeah? It is an epistemic space too. And what I mean by that, it is a space of knowledge making, that it shared common parameters regarding the conditions, intellectual conditions, material conditions, institutional conditions. So think about bookmaking, think about institutions of learning, madrasas, universities, etc. All the conditions that make truth claims possible, right? I'll come back to it in a bit. It is in this multicultural and multifaceted universe that Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in 570 AD. And in due course, he would oversee the founding of yet a new tradition, perhaps beginning to receive revelation in his 40th year. Indeed, the Quran itself is perhaps the greatest single testimony to this diverse world of late antique Arabia, insofar as it consciously, the Quran that is, formulates itself as a continuation of an older universal message conveyed through a long series of prophetic cycles that reach their culmination with the Prophet Muhammad as Khatim al-Anbiya. And the Quran itself, in both its language and subject matter, is a text that is continually in dialogue with its context. If any of you have read the Quran, you will see this all the time. There's a description of a situation, qul, and then the Prophet is instructed to respond to it. So it's a text that speaks to its context, right? Moreover, in the course of the centuries following Muhammad, a dedicated effort would be launched to make accessible in Arabic as much as possible from the intellectual production of the older traditions of thought. Often described simply as the translation movement, thousands of foundational scholarly texts were translated into Arabic, mostly from Greek, but also from Persian, Syriac, Sanskrit, and other languages, especially in Abbasid Baghdad. It is the cumulative effect of these developments that forms the intellectual landscape within which our authors wrote their texts. But the main point to keep in mind concerning this translation movement is that however monumentally important it was, and it was important, right? It built upon already existing trends of cultural, religious, and linguistic intermingling, including pre-Islamic Arabia. So to sum up our first crucial point, Islam is not some bizarre ideology that jumped out of an empty desert and had to deal with the higher cultures of the late antique world. It was part and parcel of that world from the start. Okay? The second important concept, Islam is a tradition. Understanding the emergence of Islam as belonging to the world of late antiquity requires an appreciation for what historians call deep time and broad space that the concept itself evokes, given its emphasis on continuities with the past. The very idea of late antiquity, therefore, is an incitement to us to think about the shared commonalities across cultures, civilizations, if you like, but also texts and traditions. And this is one of the ways that the texts we are reading can speak to us today, asking us to think beyond the all too common clash of civilizations. However, we also know that Jews are not the same as Christians, and Christians are not the same as pagans, and pagans are certainly not the same as Muslims. So it is equally important to recognize and explain the differences within traditions, not just between traditions, but within the traditions. Muhammad's project did articulate itself as a distinct revolution, cut off in many ways from the past out of which it emerged. This past it now called the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance. And a very practical example of how Muhammad's project created a break from the past is to institute a whole new calendar, the Hijri calendar, the first year of which begins with the immigration of the Prophet and his small community of followers from Mecca to a neighboring town called Yathrib, which would soon become known quite simply as Al-Madinah al-Munawwara. The new calendar marked the founding of a new Islamic community that was led by the Prophet Muhammad, but it also marked it off from other traditions around it. So, simply folding Islam uncritically into some all-inclusive notion of late antiquity, and the way I tend to explain this to my students is that this is not a group hug. This is not about everybody is one and at one and there's no frictions. There's definitely differences both within and between traditions. And so we cannot fold Islam uncritically into some all-encompassing late antiquity. It would deny the originality of the new teachings, and it would prove unfaithful to the historical sources and actors involved. The challenge then is to find a way to make use of both propositions together, to juxtapose them, in other words, by taking seriously both the continuity and coherence of late antiquity as a shared epistemic space, but also the radical break from the past that is involved with any affirmation of a new tradition. And this is where thinking through the notion of Islam as a tradition seems important to me. By tradition, I do not mean the common understanding of the word as that which is old or unchanging, as opposed to something that's modern, new, or dynamic. Rather, I mean by tradition an arena that sustains, in ways that are both conscious and unconscious, a particular mode of life, a mode of thought, a particular way of being and of knowing in the world, and of thinking, that are continually in dialogue with the founding texts of the tradition. In the case of Islam, the founding texts are first and foremost the Quran, the revelation as the eternal word of God that predates time and space, but that was consecutively revealed to humans since the dawn of time, and the Sunnah, the deeds and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that were transmitted to the community as a central authority, a model on how to live a good Muslim life. These two elements together form the linchpin of Islamic tradition across the centuries, and they remain central to it to this day. Now, what is crucial about tradition in this sense is that it is not opposed to reason. It's not opposed to rational thinking. Yeah? It is rather the very condition, the thing that makes rational thinking possible in the first place. In other words, tradition is not fixed, it's not static, unchanging, and unmoving. Debate and change are integral to it. And this is why questions relating to whether this or that is halal or haram or makruh, allowed or prohibited or reprehensible, are constantly negotiated in Islamic settings. From the simplest questions, such as, is smoking tobacco acceptable? Is wearing jeans okay? Etc., right? To the most serious and profound questions, is free market economics a good thing? What should our understanding and relationship be to the environment? What is the best way to reach the truth of things? And this is another way that these texts are classics. They still speak to us today, demonstrating beyond a shadow of a doubt that tradition and reason are not mutually contradictory, so that the world can simply not be neatly divided into unthinking religious types and thinking secular types. And it's precisely this that allows a certain intellectual continuity and universality of thought from Plato and before him to Muhammad and beyond, to stand in balance with a firm affirmation of the particular singularity of Islam and the preoccupation of forging a community, an ummah, defining who's in, who's out, what are its aims, its forms of being, its forms of knowing, of acting, of building, of making, all things that we can now define as Islamic. Okay? This balance between the old and the new has preoccupied Muslim thinkers in various ways from the start, and it is this epistemic challenge that characterizes Muhammad's prophetic mission itself. But it would become even more acute following his death. This was a foundational moment in the tradition, as the new ummah had to fend for itself without the direct presence and authority of the Prophet. And soon it would find itself expanded from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, a huge geographical expanse of enormous cultural diversity with which the tradition had to engage. Think about this a little. The same founding texts, the Quran and the Sunnah, will mean something both quite similar and yet distinctly different in, say, Senegal than they would in Indonesia. Okay. There's almost from the start then different positions on this fundamental question of how to balance the old and the new. And these are often framed with broad labels such as rationalists, those who appeal above all to human reason, traditionalists, those who assert the primacy of the transmitted tradition, so the Quran and the Hadith, legalists, those who adopt a legal interpretation of scripture. You've heard of something called fiqh, I suppose, Islamic law. And mystics, those who emphasize a more spiritual mode of religious life. These labels are both helpful and problematic in equal measure. And again, you may wish to discuss them more fully in your classes. For us here, what is important to highlight once more is the common fundamental question that undergirds them collectively. How is knowledge, including pre-Islamic and non-Islamic knowledge, grounded in tradition? And this is what your texts are essentially dealing with. Okay? So, to end this section on tradition and late antiquity, we might pose the following question. How does one justify and legitimize knowledge as one perceives it in its immediacy, but also as you apprehend it, right? Or how you receive it from the many past. So you can either come across knowledge through your own perceptions, you can apprehend knowledge, but you can also receive it through tradition, right? From the past, from your parents, from your teachers, from books, etc. The key question, or to put it more simply, is how do I know? I'm sorry, hold on. Right. The key question here, or to put it more simply, is how do I know that what I know is true? How can I arrive at certainty in knowing? And this is what I mean by epistemic certainty. Okay? These are fundamental questions of human existence, and it is because the texts that you are reading this week deal with these questions that they are able to still stimulate us so many centuries later. So let's turn to our texts and our authors. Ikhwan al-Safa. Little is known about the group of anonymous Muslim intellectuals who call themselves Ikhwan al-Safa wa Kullan al-Wafa wa Ahli al-Hamd wa Abna al-Majd, the brethren of purity, the loyal friends, the people of praise, and the sons of glory. Their importance stems from them having collectively authored an important work, an encyclopedia of sorts, in which they attempted to gather and classify all knowledge that was available during their time in the form of 52 epistles or tracts, simply known as the Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa. Sectioned into 4 broad subject fields, the epistles covers a wide range of topics and disciplines, from arithmetic, geometry, logic, physics, astronomy, magic, and natural philosophy, to geography and music, metaphysics, ethics, theology, politics, pedagogy, belles lettres, mysticism. The list goes on and on. I would run out of breath trying to classify these works. Operating as a secret society, the members of this group met regularly to partake in intellectual pursuits and rituals that drew from a wide array of cultures, all in the spirit of brotherhood and mutual aid between a socially diverse collective of seekers of knowledge who saw themselves as united in an ostensible spiritual city, a mystical utopia of sorts, which they called Dawlat al-Khair, the abode of the good. Beyond this, the Ikhwan remain very much an enigma, so that practically everything that we know of them is a matter of scholarly speculation. This begins with their actual identities, which they deliberately kept secret, and it extends to their intellectual, political, sectarian, and creedal affiliations. The speculation even involves such simple facts as the period and place in which they were writing, although there is now some consensus that the brethren were based in the cities of Basra and Baghdad in modern-day Iraq and were active sometime around the last quarter of the 10th century. Now, by contrast, we know a great deal more about our second author. Abu Hamid Muhammad bin Muhammad al-Ghazali is one of the most celebrated scholars of Islam. World famous already in his time, his imprint on the development of Islamic thought earned him the honorific title of Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam, and the renewer, the mujaddid of the faith. This places al-Ghazali among some of the greatest luminaries in Islam's historic hall of fame, and ensures the continuing relevance of his thought and writings to the present day, supporters and detractors alike. In other words, if you love him or you hate him, you have to contend with him somehow. Al-Ghazali was born into a family of modest means in the village of Ghazaleh on the outskirts of Tus in today's northeastern Iran in 1058. Orphaned at a young age, he received an elementary education in Tus before traveling to Jurjan and then Nishapur, where he undertook an extensive program of study under the city's most eminent ulama. I've tried to trace his movements on this map, but I don't know if you can see the circles of the main cities. If you can't, the map will be available online as well, so you can see it there. Within a few years, Al-Ghazali had already begun making a name for himself as a leading scholar, a prolific writer, and an impressive teacher. This earned him the attention of Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful wazir of the Seljuks, a dynasty that controlled vast territories under the nominal suzerainty or sovereignty of the Abbasids. Nizam al-Mulk invited al-Ghazali to teach at the newly founded educational college in Baghdad, al-Madrasa al-Nizamiya, the Harvard, or if you like, the AUB of its time. Okay? Fantastic institution. Reaching the summit of his professional career, Al-Ghazali suddenly undergoes a severe crisis and decides to retreat from teaching and public life. He reflects on the reasons for this withdrawal in the text that you are reading this week. And there he weaves together a personal or a spiritual explanation with an intellectual one. Now, if you're beginning to see parallels here with St. Augustine, then you're paying attention. because these two figures would come to represent a particular strand of philosophical thought broadly identified as medieval skepticism. Al-Ghazali abandoned his position and his family and embarked on a long period, over a decade, of aesthetic wanderings, which took him from Baghdad to Syria to Palestine and the Hijaz, and finally back to Tus again. It was during this period that he authored his most famous work, Ihya Ulumuddin, in which he reflected on the relationship between law, theology, and mysticism, tasawwuf, and which, along with his early works on jurisprudence and his two main philosophical contributions, Maqasid al-Falasifa, where he expounds on the Neoplatonist ideas of the Muslim philosophers Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, and Tahafut al-Falasifa, where he sets about debunking many of their main tenets. These texts, and especially Ihya Ulumuddin, secured Al-Ghazali's enduring legacy as both a highly revered and a highly controversial figure in Islamic thought. The text before you, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, or The Deliverance from Error, was written a few years before his death in 1111 AD. He was reportedly buried in the Haruniya complex in Tus, which you see here, which is where his mausoleum is said to still stand. Now, hailing from different backgrounds, experiences, and intellectual milieus, and separated by shifting geographical locations and at least a century of time, an eventful century at that, our authors may appear to represent two separate strands of classical Islamic thought. One, syncretically grounded in philosophical ideas and Gnostic spirituality, freely espousing an ecumenical, liberal spirit of tolerance that blended monotheistic and non-monotheistic cultures and beliefs, and the other characterized by an ambivalence towards philosophy, more concerned with maintaining a revised orthodoxy that wants to accommodate both mystical and legal approaches to Islamic thought. The variances are also clear in the two texts before you, which belong to totally different genres of writing. The first is a literary narrative in the form of a well-known satirical fable aimed at delivering an ethical, ecological message. The second, Al-Ghazali's text, is a self-conscious intellectual tract deliberating on the meaning and methods of true knowledge that is punctuated with autobiographical references. All of these differences concerning the context of the authors, the form, content, and genesis, and even the reception of their ideas over time are, of course, important, and I suspect you will discuss them at some length in your individual sections. Here, I would like to suggest to you, keeping in mind what I've already said about change and continuity in the making of tradition, that these two texts ultimately share a fundamental unity. They share a unity as knowledge-making projects. Now, in the time left, I will highlight a few details that point to that direction before concluding on their implications. Okay, the case of the animals versus man before the king of the jinn. In Epistle 22 of the Rasail, and after a brief introductory universal history setting the gradual abuse of the earth by mankind, the Ikhwan present an allegorical fable involving an arbitration, much like a modern court case, if you will, in which animals submit a complaint about their mistreatment at the sons of Adam to the king of the jinn, right? The jinn is a type of being which exists in a parallel dimension and are said to exercise supernatural influence on human beings. Humans and the animals are both summoned before the king, and a jury made of philosophers, poets, magicians, and social mendicants to present their case. The human spokesperson begins by asserting, "These cattle, beasts of prey and wild creatures, all animals, in fact, are our slaves. We are their masters. Some have rebelled and escaped. Others obey grudgingly and scorn our service." When asked by the king to put forward the proof or evidence that backs up this claim, the human representative responds, "Your Majesty, we have both traditional religious arguments and rational proofs for our position." "Very well, let's hear them," the king replies. And from there, the drama unfolds as the animal representatives, headed by the mule, begin to challenge each and every argument that the humans put forward. From the onset, then, the question of epistemic certainty, remember that question, how do I know that what I know is true, right? The question of epistemic certainty as the basis for true knowledge and its relationship to both demonstrative proof, i.e. rational proofs on the one hand, and arguments that are derived from revelation and prophetic authority from the Quran and the Sunnah on the other, foregrounds the events that ensue. Interestingly, what transpires is not simply a sequential deployment of two types of methods. Something like, here's my religious argument, and if that's not convincing you, here's my rational argument. That's not what transpires in this text. But rather, the two forms of argument are seamlessly integrated together in the responses of the animals. Demonstrative reasoning lies at the basis of the speech of both parties, the humans and the animals, just as they both always couch their discourse in reference to the Quran and the Sunnah. Now, so smoothly is this effected that in the end, the only point of distinction pivots not on whether using scripture makes for rational argumentation in and of itself, but on the nature of the interpretation of the scripture. It's tafsir, in other words. The extent to which it privileges a manifest or literal meaning, zahir, or a deeper, more esoteric or hidden meaning, batin. Okay? Instances of this are tangible in almost all the arguments discussed through the use of the constant refrain, but only those who are well-rooted in knowledge can comprehend. We see this throughout the text. More telling, perhaps, is the example in chapter 5, entitled "The Animals Charge Humans with Oppression." There, it begins with an interesting challenge to the idea of natural slavery, the proposition that some beings are essentially and inherently unequal and therefore are natural slaves to others. To debunk the human claim that their mastery over the animals is a given, because the latter, the animals, depend on them for food, water, shelter, etc., the animals deploy a new method of proof, a recurrent chain, a silsila, of testimonials, one after the other, from all the creatures present. First the ass, then the ox, then the ram, the elephant, the horse, even the accursed and grotesque pig, who has the most to complain about. This method of deducing evidence drawn from eyewitness accounts extended over time is well established in the fiqh, in Islamic jurisprudence, and in the sciences of hadith. And it would come to characterize the very idea of learning itself in the Islamic tradition. Crucially, this method relies on the primacy not of the knowledge itself, not on whether the knowledge itself is true or not, but on the tawatur, right? So what you're looking for is not the content of what is being transmitted. What you're paying attention to is the chain of transmission in itself. Who is transmitting? How? What is the gap between these transmissions? Are the transmitters trustworthy? And this is how you establish a hadith, an isnad in a hadith, and it's also how you establish learning in the Islamic tradition. And we see that played out in this text. Okay. These issues of method are again woven into discussions of other themes which the Ikhwan take up. For instance, the fable's location in the compendium, coming as it does under the section entitled Physical and Natural Sciences, demonstrates an engagement with Greek and notably Aristotelian philosophical and zoological ideas that would make their way into the Islamic tradition. At the same time, the fable is satirical, and it's didactic, meaning it's a tool designed to comment on various aspects of the human condition and to admonish to higher moral ideas that are rendered in a simple form. So think, for example, about stories that you may have been told as a young child, Al-Ghurab al-Nabi, right? Or the tortoise and the hare. You know that story? You all know that story. The lazy tortoise takes a nap, other way around. The hare takes a nap and the tortoise slowly perseveres. These again are also fables, yeah? Didactic tools for teaching a certain way of being. Fables are by definition able to cross cultural and historical boundaries precisely because at their kernel, at their heart, is a deeper enduring message that is seen as a universal truth. In the case of the animals versus man, the basic message remains loud and clear. Humans must answer for the consequences of their willful and destructive treatment of the earth and its non-human inhabitants. But for the Ikhwan, this is just the starting point. For they are able to weave in their story several other levels of interpretation that involve larger cosmological doctrines about the relationship between creation and the Creator, as asserted in the Quran, where man is enjoined to reflect on the reality of the divine through his ayat, or signs, so that the ultimate fount of all knowledge is the divine who emanates and reveals himself in full glory in the world. Likewise, the ultimate purpose of knowledge is asserted in the fable on two levels. The first is the earthly domain of happiness, harmony, and peace, and we see this played out in the mediation on the nature of the just ruler, who is personified here by the king of the jinn, a wise, merciful, and harmonious king who regulates through the law and presides over a harmonious realm and whose authority is recognized by both parties in the dispute, and in the disentangling of things such as the meaning of power versus submission, mastery versus bondage, tyranny versus mercy, truth, falsehood, ignorance, etc. Whether these are fixed or essential attributes, or whether they are instead accidental and ephemeral, and therefore can be corrected through a conscientious program of social, pedagogical, and possibly political reform. These points are all bulleted on your fly sheet, by the way, those of you who are drifting off. Okay. The second level we might think of is the level of individual salvation, the ultimate end of the Ikhwan's soteriological outlook being the fulfillment of God's promise in the final return of all souls to their Maker. It is this in the end that gives value to their insistence on friendship and mutual assistance among humankind in order to fulfill the trust given to them by God, that trust being the earth and its bounties, and their covenantal duty to know and worship God alone. There is clearly much more that can be said about this fascinating text, but we must now turn quickly to Al-Ghazali, who shares some of these three levels of interpretation. This is what I'd like to show you. The issue of method, truth being contingent upon demonstrative proof anchored in revelation, the question of the social ends of knowledge, and finally, the individual concern for salvation in the world to come. Al-Ghazali. Delivered in an autobiographical mode at the supposed behest of a fellow knowledge seeker, the deliverance from error, or the Munqidh min al-Dalal, is written in the first person singular and recounts the basic steps of the author's intellectual journey. The text pivots around a moment of crisis, during which the scholar suffered an attack of severe doubt, skepticism, that led him to question the most basic truths, those derived from tradition, as well as from sensory experience, as well as from reason, right? All three he questions. To those of you who will take CVSP 203 from the second sequence, you may want to note here the remarkable similarities of this part of the text with René Descartes' later account. Now, Al-Ghazali's argument then examines and seeks to challenge what the author sees as three major types of truth claims. One, based on theology, kalam. Two, based on authoritative instruction, ta'aleem. Three, based on philosophy, falsafa. The first he dismisses for being merely defensive. The second for being unreasonable. And the third for being incoherent. None of these approaches, in other words, could provide Al-Ghazali with a firm ground for absolute truth. It is important here to remember that Al-Ghazali's point is not to reject the conclusions of these various schools wholesale, everything, all at once, but simply to find an anchor for truth in what he describes as a profound and treacherous sea of knowledge. He draws continually on scripture, he embraces theology, of course, and he confirms the importance of the authority of an infallible imam, which for him can only be the Prophet Muhammad, precisely because of the primacy he gives to the idea of prophecy, to which he dedicates a passage in the text. Most importantly, he explicitly, can you stop talking, please? Thank you. Most importantly, he explicitly acknowledges the veracity or truthfulness of most of the propositions of the philosophers. The problem with them, in his view, being the dangerous social implications of their teachings for the untrained or gullible reader, either total acceptance, including what Ghazali perceives as non-Islamic elements, or total rejection, making Islam ultimately irrational. Neither outcome will do for Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali is only rescued from his skepticism by the light of God, who is indeed the ultimate deliverer, or munqidh, from error, providing a social ground for the certainty of truth, solid ground, for the certainty of truth. The text then moves on to extol a fourth category of knowledge seekers based on mystical experience and the primacy of what he calls the qalb, the heart, the real nature of man's spirit, which is the seat of his knowledge of God. The Sufi way of life, Al-Ghazali writes, cannot be learned from simple study, but must be lived holistically, which explains why he chose to give up teaching and live as an aesthetic wanderer for many years. The basic insight conditions his approach to the proof of prophecy and the availability of truth beyond reason. Right? He can perceive a realm of truth that is outside of reason. Only this allows the grounding of knowledge, the resolution of his skepticism, and the affirmation of belief, and indeed reorients the very principles of everyday life, so that when Al-Ghazali does return to the normality of his previous life, he is radically transformed. He writes, "In myself," are the quotes up there, "in myself I know that even if I went back," "In myself I know that even if I went back to the work of disseminating knowledge, yet I did not go back. To go back is to return to the previous state of things. Previously, however, I had been disseminating the knowledge by which worldly success is attained. But now I am calling men to the knowledge whereby worldly success is given up. It is my earnest longing that I make myself and others better. I do not know whether I shall reach my goal or whether I shall be taken while short of my object. I believe, however, both by certain faith and by intuition, that there is no power and no might save with God, the High, the Mighty, and that I do not move of myself, but I am moved by Him. I do not work of myself, but I am used by Him." End quote. Now, the echoes with Augustine here are palpable in this passage, but so too are the same three levels of concern. Level 1, the basis of certain knowledge. Level 2, its social and political significances. Level 3, its salvational or soteriological, that's just a fancy way of saying salvation, soteriological ends, right? Again, a reflection on the similarities between the texts does not mean that we efface their differences or we ignore their differences, but it does help us see, I hope, how tradition works and how Islamic thought as a category can actually make sense. The concern for epistemological certainty, how do I know that what I know is true, displayed in the two texts and their mobilization of different methods of reasoning is always pegged in the final analysis to Scripture, to the Quran and the modular example of the Prophet. This then is what puts the Islamic in Islamic thought. And it is also in light of this imperative that Al-Ghazali and Muslim philosophers and theologians before and after him spent so much time examining and elaborating upon the meaning of the proofs of prophecy. In other words, if knowledge is a deep and treacherous sea, Al-Ghazali, as Al-Ghazali eloquently describes it, tradition is what anchors the seeker on her journey through this life to the next and delivers her to safety by God's will. The task of reading and interpreting these texts and their details, I of course leave to you in your individual sessions, and I hope you will repeatedly go back to these texts, because like all of the CVSP curriculum, these are texts that ought to remain with you your whole life. But before I free you, before you start packing up, all of you who have started packing up, okay, before I free you, I'd like to draw your attention to a few broad pointers that I think are crucial, especially in this day and age. In other words, what makes these books or these texts, classics in my view, worthy of inclusion in our canon? First, both these texts demonstrate magisterially that it is unhelpful to think in terms of a strict dichotomy, a strict division between reason and revelation. The traditional division between al-manqul wal-ma'qul strikes me as more interesting and fruitful analysis, and this you can take up in your sections. Secondly, it is impossible, as a result of the deep and wide intermingling that I have tried to describe above in relation to tradition and late antiquity, to speak of cultural borrowing, or of a particular science, theory, or idea as belonging specifically to a one group or another. What is more interesting, it seems to me, is to precisely trace how ideas live and adapt over time and space. Thirdly, and combining the 2 points above, when it comes to pre-modern knowledge, it is deeply problematic to imagine some monolithic and coherent concept of a sphere of something called religion that is battling it out against another self-evident and independent concept or sphere of philosophy. As we see in the case of Al-Ghazali, even his supposed rejection of philosophy was wittingly and unwittingly philosophical, and in fact, highly original and influential in subsequent philosophy, both Eastern and Western. And I hope that many of you will go on to do higher degrees here at AUB in philosophy, in Islamic studies, etc., in history, that will allow you to pursue these trains of thought clearer. To concluding. What is perhaps most inspiring and insightful in these authors, and if you are to remember, those of you who have not been paying attention at all, if you are to remember just one thing from this lecture, it is the value of polymathesis. Okay? Rather than the increasing narrow specialization of our academic disciplines and their strict divisions into art and science, I'm an engineer, why the hell do I need to read Ghazali? Or I'm an artist, why do I need to do anything on the history of science, say, right? Rather than these arbitrary divisions, Al-Ghazali and the Ikhwan too were polymaths, right? They were scholars who viewed knowledge as an organic and a complete whole, and who were accordingly able to discuss and draw on a broad range of topics and subjects to think through the issues of their day as deeply involved citizens of the world. This concern with an all-rounded education did not belong to Muslims alone, but was simply a feature of all knowledge, right? Full stop, including in Western Europe. What mattered most, what was crucial, was the purpose to which knowledge was put, and by extension, its ability to instruct its bearer on the meaning and methods of living a good life, its edifying function, in other words. Accordingly, the perfect man of Ikhwan al-Safa, the man Al-Ghazali aspires to be, finds echoes in the Renaissance man of European humanism, leaping forward towards our own liberal arts here at AUB. Education is also about edification, and this is the very raison d'être of CVSP, and this is why you have to take it seriously, and this is why you have to sit here on this fine Monday afternoon and listen to me. Thanks for your attention.